Shri Satish Goyal ji and Shri Jagjit Singh Jack Sahab, my fellow co-speaker and a brilliant chartered accountant turned lawyer Somil Agrawal, and a galaxy and hosts of my professional friends who are attending this webinar. The topic noticeable notices and responsible responses. Therefore, the name of this topic evokes the obvious curiosity, and having regard to that curiosity in mind, first of all, I would request Somil to take us through the various types of notices issued by the tax department for what purposes, and then I will pick up the thread where he leaves, and then the aspects of the notices and the replies which would make very effective hearing, then that I will take. So at the outset, I would request Somil to kindly traverse us through the various types of notices, for what purposes they are issued, what are the likely implications of those notices coming out of them, and then I will then take up. Somil.
Thank you, sir. My Guru, Gupta sir, Satish sir, Jagjit sir, and my dear friends. So, as my friends, you all must have noticed from the topic today that
गूंज रही है आवाज. Yes.
Is it better now?
Yes, it is better.
Much better.
Yeah. So the various types of notices, notices which are issued for various purposes, which includes investigations, inquiries, assessments, show cause purposes, where some additions which are being show cause. So notices, we have tried to categorize them in different categories. The first type of notices which I would discuss is the notices for the purpose of verification, for inquiry.
If you want to share screen,
I'll do that.
Okay.
So verification notices, the first section that comes to my mind for that purpose, which is section 12AA and the recently introduced section 12AB. The sections for
voice is echoing. Voice is echoing.
Somil, have you started? Somil, I think, please remove this and talk to through computer or with this
let's try it.
audio. Attach computer audio. I mean, accept that computer audio one.
I've been. Hello.
Yes.
Yes. Much better.
Is it better now?
Yes.
All right. I'll do it without the earphones. So as I was discussing, the notices for the purpose of verification, the first notice which I would like to highlight is in section 12AA and in section 12AB. These sections in which assessees file application for registration of charitable institutes and trusts. So under these provisions, the commissioner has the power to call for information, to make inquiries, to make verifications of the documents, of the books, of the financial information of all the activities, so as to analyze and see and verify that whether the activities are being carried out for charitable purposes, whether the objects are for charitable purpose, and also whether the activities are genuine or not. So this is the first portion where we see that the notices are being issued for the purpose of verification. These are the verification notices. Similarly, we see notices in respect of approvals, like approvals under section 1023C6. Again, the authorities, the competent authority issues notices where they are verifying whether the institute or university having applied for the approval is working for solely for the purpose of education or not. Another notice on similar lines for verification, to my recollection, is under section 264. Now the commissioner on receiving an application for the purpose of revision of assessment order, calls for information, calls for documentation, and verifies whether the claim of the assessee that the order requires revision is correct or not. So again, this type of notice is again for the purpose of verification or inquiries made under that provision. So you would kindly recall that in cases, especially 148 cases where there was cash deposit, a huge number of notices were initially received by the assessees with the title as verification based on AIR information received by the department. So these notices were issued by the assessing officer as verification notices on the basis of the AIR information to verify the source of cash or to verify the investments made in the property. So, and whether these notices are valid, are legal, this we'll discuss a little later. So this is the first category of notice, which are, I can categorize them as the notice for the purpose of inquiry in the nature of verification. The second category which I would discuss is the investigation notices or inquiry notices during assessment. So during assessment, I'll just share my screen. Is it visible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. So the investigations, the inquiries made during assessments. So the first notice that comes to my mind is section 143(2) notice. So this is a jurisdictional notice also, and this is a notice which is required to be issued by the assessing officer, where in respect of the return filed under 139(1), under section 139, or a return filed in response to 142(1) notice, if the assessing officer wants to verify the returned income filed by the assessee or to verify the claim of loss made by the assessee, then in such cases, the assessing officer is required to serve the notice under 143(2), and that too within the time limit prescribed under section 143(2). The time limit is within 6 months from the end of the financial year in which the return is filed. So, sir, 143(2) is the notice which is required whenever assessing officer wants to examine the return. It is a jurisdictional notice. It is a basic notice that empowers him to examine, to see whether to ask the assessee to justify the return filed by the assessee. Now, section 142(1) notice. 142(1) notice, which are also issued for the purpose of inquiry and before assessment, and even in some situations during the assessment. Now, 142(1) notice is issued in two scenarios. One, where the assessee has not made a return of income within a time allowed under 139(1), or before the end of the relevant assessment year. In such case, assessing officer may require the assessee by issuing notice under 142(1) that the assessee shall file a return in response to the notice under section 142(1). Even during the course of assessment, where the assessing officer requires the assessee to produce some information, accounts or documents, then in such case, 142(1) notice is issued during the course of assessment requiring the assessee to provide information for the purpose of inquiry or assessment being made by the assessing officer. Even in 142(1), the assessing officer can require the assessee to furnish in writing and in verified situation in the prescribed manner on the points as required by the assessing officer, which may even include statement of all assets and liability, whether included in the accounts or not. So even this information can be required by the assessing officer and can be asked by way of notice under 142(1). However, where the assessing officer is required to ask the assessee to furnish a statement of all assets and liabilities, then prior approval is required from the Joint Commissioner. Further, the information which the assessing officer can require from the assessee, he cannot go beyond 3 years, relevant to the 3 years prior to the previous year in question, for the purpose of production of any accounts under section and in respect of the notice which is issued under 142 subsection 1. Now, sir, the powers the assessing officer have and what inquiry that they can make. Section 131. So section 131 empowers an assessing officer, a commissioner, the commissioner, the joint commissioner, the principal commissioners to and it has vested them the same powers which are vested in the court under Code of Civil Procedure, that is by trying a suit. So the powers are which are given under the CPC Act have been incorporated under Section 131 and have been given to the assessing officer in which he has during the course of assessment proceedings. So these powers are, number one, powers which he can enforce discovery and inspection, enforce the attendance of any person, including any officer of a banking company, and examine him on oath. Third, compelling the production of books of accounts and other documents. And fourth, issuing commissions. So as far as subsection 1 of 131 is concerned, the authorities prescribed there have the power during the course any proceeding are pending before them to apply these four powers which have been provided to them under section 131(1). Apart from that, while the proceedings are pending, while the assessment proceedings are going on, the further powers which are available under section 133 subsection 6. The notice which is issued under section 133(6). Power to call for information. So the assessing officer, Commissioner Appeals, for that matter, they can require any person, including the banking company or any officer thereof, to furnish information in relation to any point, any matters which they require for the which would be helpful for the purpose of relevant inquiry proceeding under the Act. They can require them to furnish statement of accounts, statement of affairs, verified in the manner prescribed by the assessing officer. So these powers under 133(6), the assessing officer can exercise, requiring an assessee to provide all these details during the proceeding pending before the assessing officer. These powers under 133(6) can also be exercised by the authority of the investigation wing, that is Principal Director General, Principal Chief Commissioner, Principal Commissioner, and Joint Director, Deputy Director, Assistant Director. Now, sir, these were the provisions, these were the powers under 143(2), 142(1), the notices being issued, 133(6), 131(1), which were being issued during the course of assessment proceedings. But what about the situation where no proceedings are pending? So the major and the broadest power which I have seen, widest power that we have seen is under section 131, subsection 1 capital A, which is mostly with the authorities and the investigation wing of the department. That is powers with the principal director, the director, joint director, AD, DD, or the authorized officer under 132(1). And if the officer has the reason to suspect that any income is concealed or is likely to be concealed by any person or class of person within his jurisdiction, then for the purpose of inquiry or investigation, he can exercise the powers which were given in subsection 1. That is the four powers of the CPC Act which have been imported under 131. One, that can be exercised by the investigation wing. The horse, notwithstanding that no proceeding with respect to such person or class of person is pending before him or any income tax authority. So that is the kind of wide power that the investigation wing has, and they can issue notice under 131(1)(a). So in fact, these are the notices I can say which can even lead to the action of search against any assessee if the assessee fails to respond or responds in a manner that is not to the satisfactory of the officer. So similarly, under 131 subsection 2, similar powers have been given to the authorities which have been prescribed under 131(1), where inquiry or investigation is in respect of any person or class of person in relation to any agreement referred to in section 90 or 90A, agreement for sharing of information across the countries. So any information and inquiry and investigation in respect of that, they have power to issue notice under 131(2) and require information, make inquiries, notwithstanding that any the proceedings in respect of such person is not pending before such officer or any other income tax authority. Similarly, 133(6) can be issued by such authorities as per the proviso, second proviso and third proviso, and it provides, and there is a safeguard given there that provides that where the power under 133(6) to make inquiry, to call for information is being exercised in a case where no proceeding is pending, shall not be exercised by any authority below the rank of principal director, principal commissioner, other than the joint director, deputy director, or assistant director, without prior approval of the principal director or principal commissioner or director thereof. So the safeguard is governed in case of notice issued under 133(6) that such notice where there is no proceeding pending shall not be exercised by authorities below the rank prescribed under this second proviso. Even 133(6) can be issued for the by the authorities which have been conferred power under 131 subsection 2 to exercise powers under this section of 133(6) to call for information under 133(6), notwithstanding that no proceedings are pending before them or any other income tax authority. So this was the third category of notices which are being issued, which can be issued where inquiry or investigation can be made divorce that any assessment or any proceeding are pending before the authority. So the fourth category, kind of notices which are issued are jurisdictional notices. The first notice that I touched upon is section 143 subsection 2. As I discussed, this is a notice which can be issued by assessing officer to examine the return. Unless this notice is issued and is served within the time provided under 143.2 proviso, it would fall in the, it would be illegal, and the non-issuance of this notice cannot be cured even by the provisions of section 292BB. Section 292BB, which provides that where assessee has participated, assessee has replied, has participated in the proceeding, and in such cases, assessee, it shall be deemed that any notice under this act, if it has been served, shall be deemed to have been served, and the assessee will not be allowed to question that the notice has not been served properly, has not been served in time, or has not been served in the proper manner as per law. Provided, it provides that provided if the assessee makes an objection, then obviously 292BB will not come into play. But objection has to be raised before completion of assessment or reassessment proceedings. However, when it comes to 143.2 issuance, 292BB cannot cure the non-issuance of a jurisdictional notice such as 143.2. And recently, Honorable Supreme Court in the case of Lakshman Das Khandelwal have held that the non-issuance of notice cannot be cured by 292BB. 292BB, for the purpose of 292BB, the notice must emanate from the department. The notice must be issued. 292BB, if at all, can be applied to cure the service of notice. But as far as if there is non-issuance of notice, the proceedings are bad in law. The next notice, jurisdictional notice, the proceedings which are initiated under section 147, the notice is issued under section 148. This has to be issued within the time limit provided under section 149, 4 years, 6 years, 16 years, as per the time limit provided under section 149. So sir, a question like we just discussed in 143.2, the time limit is that provides that the notice should be served within the time limit. However, in case of 148 notice, the time limit under section 149 requires the assessing officer that the notice should be issued by the provided time under 149. So the question arises, all right, assessing officer has issued a notice within the time limit. Say 31st March is the time barring, on 30th he issues the notice. However, it is served later on in April 1st week. So whether the proceedings are valid? So sir, the requirement of 149, the time limit which is prescribed is for issuance of notice. The issue of notice must be there within the time limit. However, the notice has to be served. And the reason that I'm emphasizing on service in case of 148 is this, that there are two types of jurisdiction which the assessing officer has. Jurisdiction to assess and jurisdiction to make the assessment order. Now in case when he issues the notice in time, within time limit provided under 149, the assessing officer gets the jurisdiction to assess. But section 148 provides that before making assessment, reassessment or recomputation, under section 147, an assessing officer shall be required to issue notice, shall serve the notice requiring the assessee to furnish return under section so-and-so and the prescribed matter, and such return shall be dealt with as if, so far as the provision of this act may apply, as if the return is returned under section 139(1). So this provision in the second line provides that the assessing officer before making assessment, reassessment or recomputation shall serve. So unless the 148 notice is served in accordance with law, the assessing officer will not get the jurisdiction to make the reassessment. So issuance is important within the time limit to get the jurisdiction to assess, and the jurisdiction to pass the assessment order would be achieved only if the notice is served in accordance with law. It may be served after the time limit for issuing 148 notice, but obviously it should be served before making the reassessment order and should be served in accordance with law. So the next jurisdictional notice is notices which are issued. In fact, one more point which I wanted to highlight, as I mentioned, that in case of 148, the assessing officer requires the assessee to file a return in response to 148. The assessee files return. So once the assessee files return, when the assessing officer proceeds to process that return in this reassessment proceedings, again is required to issue 143(2) jurisdictional notice to assess that return. And that notice has to be issued by the assessing officer. This is derived from the language again in 148 that provides that the provisions of section 139(1) shall apply to this return as if the return has been furnished under 139(1) to the extent the provision shall apply. So, as a 139(1) return, the assessing officer is required to issue 143(2) when he wants to examine the return filed by the assessee. And sir, the non-issuance of notice under 143(2) in respect of the reassessment proceedings, it has been held that non-issuance goes to the very root is a jurisdictional irregularity, and such proceedings are bad in law, is held by the Honorable Delhi High Court in the case of Jai Shiv Shankar, 383 ITR page 448. I repeat, 383 ITR page 448, and also in Silver Line 383 ITR page 455, Honorable Delhi High Court again. So the other jurisdictional notice which we have in case of search cases, where the assessee who is searched, the assessing officer under the provision of 153A is required to assess for the preceding 6 years, preceding the year in which search has taken place. And the notice required is to be issued under section 153 capital A. And similarly, in respect of the third person, a person who may not have been searched, but any money, bullion, jewelry, valuable article that belongs to him, or any document, material, any document or book or entry which is found, which relates to such person, is found during the proceedings, then the assessing officer of the searched person shall hand over the material to the assessing officer of the person of such third person who has the assessing officer who has the jurisdiction on such person. And when they on receiving the material, the jurisdictional AO of the third person shall see whether the material has a bearing on the total income of such person, and accordingly he shall issue the jurisdictional notice under section 153 capital C to assess the person under that provision. So sir, these are the 4 notices which I wanted to discuss under the category of various jurisdictional notices which are issued. Now sir, there are a number of notices which we can say are kind of show cause notices, where the action of the authority, the action of the department is adverse to the interest of the assessee, will have the effect of either enhancing the income or reducing the lost claim, or withdrawing any claim which has been allowed to the assessee, so in such cases a show cause notice is issued. There can be different situations where show cause notices are issued. Quickly I'll just run through them. Like penalty notices, show cause is issued under section 274 subsection 1, where it provides that the assessing officer is required to grant opportunity to the assessee in respect of any penalty levied under chapter 21 of the Income Tax Act. So that show cause notice has to be issued by the assessing officer. Sir, a question arises. You may kindly recall, in the erstwhile regime of section 270(11)(c), the notice under section 270(11)(c), the provision provided for 2 charges. One was for one was for levy of penalty in case of concealment of particulars of income, and the other charge under 270(11)(c) was furnishing inaccurate particulars of income. So these 2 charges were there under section 270(11)(c). Now, number of decisions came that the notice under section 270(11)(c), initial notice issued by the assessing officer, is a jurisdictional notice, is a show cause notice, as well as it is a notice by which the assessing officer assumes jurisdiction to levy penalty under section 270(11)(c). And if the assessing officer does not strike off the inapplicable clause, that is, does not clarify the charge for which he is levying the penalty, because both the charges are mutually exclusive charges. Either it can be concealment of particulars of income, or it can be furnishing inaccurate particulars of income. So Honorable Delhi High Court in the case of Sahara, Honorable Supreme Court by dismissing SLP in the case of SSC Emerald, Honorable Karnataka High Court in the case of Manchunathan Cotton Mills 359 ITR page 565, Karnataka High Court have held that where the assessing officer has not issued the notice, has not struck off the inapplicable clause, the notice issued is vague. And once it is vague, the jurisdiction assumed to levy penalty is bad in law. Now, sir, the question I want to highlight here is, what about the position is in the new regime? Now, 270 capital A, which was introduced by Finance Act 2016 with effect from 1st April 17, that is assessment is 17-18. So this provision has been brought for the has been held that penalty to be levied in case of under-reporting of income. A plain reading of the provision shows that a plain reading of the provision would show that one may see on a first blush that yes, there are no two charges. The assessing officer will see that yes, if the returned income, processed income, and the assessed income, there is difference between them. The under-reported income arises, which is the difference between the assessed income and the processed income. Then yes, there is under-reported income and penalty shall be leviable. So there is no case of two charges. There is no case of any such satisfaction, any such charge which is to be clarified in the notice. So whether all those jurisprudence which has been laid down in respect of the two charges, whether that is no more applicable. So sir, in this I would humbly submit that although the legislature in its wisdom had drafted the law in a manner to do away with this problem of two charges, however, by reading the explanation given after subsection 3 of 270 capital A, by reading subsection 3 of section 270 AA, it is evident that still in the new regime of 270 capital A, there are two charges: one, simpliciter under-reporting of income, and two, under-reporting income in consequence of misreporting of income. So in my humble submission, even that on those judgments, the assessing officer, even the show cause notice, is required to clarify which charge he is levying on the assessee in order to levy penalty. Either it is for under-reporting of income or it is under-reporting of income in consequence of misreporting of income. The other show cause notices, say in case of enhancement by CIT appeal. Enhancement by CIT appeal, the CIT appeal is required to show cause that this is the income which I want to enhance in the case. Similarly, 263 matters where the commissioner feels that the order is prejudicial and erroneous to the interest of the revenue, and the show cause notice has to be issued by the commissioner under section 263. In case where the assessee does not file, comply the notice under 142(1) during assessment proceedings, or does not comply with all the terms of 143(2), or fails to file return in response to 139(1) within the time limit under 139(1) or 139(4) or 5, then section 144 enables the assessing officer to make a best judgment assessment. So for that, the proviso provides that he is required to issue a show cause notice under section 144, requiring the assessee to show why the assessment should not be made in the best judgment assessment manner. However, kindly note, sir, the second proviso under section 144(1), where the assessing officer has issued 142(1), he is not required to issue show cause under 144. So similarly, these are the different show cause notices which are issued by the assessing officer for the pub, and this is the category of different show cause notices issued. So these are the various categories which I wanted to discuss in respect of the notices issued under different situations which require responses by the assessee in respect of the various notices issued by the assessing officer. Before I hand over to sir, couple of provisions I want to highlight. Section 282. Section 282 provides how the notices which are provided under the Act, how service of the notice for the purpose of communication under the Act should be delivered or transmitted by the assessing officer or the authority concerned. 4 methods have been given under the provision of 282 subsection 1. Clause A, by post, approved by the court. Clause B, the method under this Code of Civil Procedure. These are the 2 methods where hard copy is sent. And clause C and D, clause C is where the notice is delivered or transmitted in form of any electronic record. And then clause D, by any other means of transmission of documents such as emails and all, provided under clause D. So these are the modes which have been prescribed, which have been recognized under Section 282 of the Income Tax Act. So a number of times we get a question that, especially after the regime of e-assessments, sir, the order has been received from the assessing officer on mail, and 10 to 12 days later, it has been received by hard copy also. So what would be the date which would be taken as a date of service for the purpose of computing the time limit for filing the appeal? So sir, in my humble submission, Section 282 has recognized that the service of the orders, service of the notices by the electronic modes, and accordingly, once the order has been received by mail, it is equal to service, and time limit would be accordingly seen from there. So service of notice and other documents under the Act have been provided under Section 282 and have also recognized the electronic mode. So much so that subsection 2 provides for the rules to be made in this regard in respect of electronic mail message, and this rule has been provided in the Rule 127. Now 127 provides for various situations of delivering or transmitting the notices through email, electronic mail messages, electronic records, and it provides under sub-rule 2 that where, and very interesting situations it provides, that in respect of clause A and B of section 282(1), that is where notice is being delivered by post or by the matter prescribed by the Code of Civil Procedure. So in such cases where hard copy is being sent, in such case the four methods that have been recognized, one to be, and this rule has been provided for the purpose of what would be the addressee, what would be the address of the addressee on which notice has to be sent. Lot of litigation has happened on which address it should be sent, an address, which address of the return, latest or old address. So these rules under 127 have been provided where addressee of the assessee has been provided on which have been recognized on which notice can be sent. So number one, they have recognized the address available in the PAN database. Second, the address available in the income tax return to which the communication relates. Now, the proceeding for which the assessing officer has initiated the proceeding, the year for which he has initiated the proceeding, the return in that for that year, the address given in that return, that would also be considered as an address on which he can send the notice. Third, the address which is available in the latest return of the assessee. And fourth, in case of company assessee, address available on the MCA. Apart from this, the proviso provides that where the assessee has provided any address furnished in writing, which is other than the address provided in the above clauses 1 to 4, then the notice has to be given on that particular address. Sir, proceeding further, they have even said that if these addresses are not available, then the addresses can be taken, which can be taken from banks, from postmasters, and as per from the postmaster record, from the post office, from insurers, and such other government agencies they have recognized under the rule from which the addresses can be taken and notices under 282 can be issued to the assessees. Sir, kindly note, a question arises, sir, PAN address, old PANs are taken, whether the assessee is required to update, why is he required to update? Even the judgments came, I remember Honorable Delhi High Court in the case of Atlanta Capital held that the notice has to be issued on the latest available address. However, that judgment is prior to this rule coming into force. Plus, kindly note, section 139(5)(a), section 139(a), capital A, subsection 5, clause D, requires that the assessee shall intimate to the assessing officer change in address, name, and nature of business on the basis of PAN has been allotted. So even that is the responsibility of the assessee, that if there is any change in the address available in the PAN, assessee is required to intimate. Regarding the other two modes given in 282, regarding the electronic modes, they have provided that in case of emails, the address available in the return in respect of which communication relates, then that would be the email address which has been recognized. The second is email address as per the latest income tax return. Then email address available in case of company assessees on the MCA website or any other email provided by the assessee. So sir, these are the addresses which have been recognized under Rule 127, which have been recognized by the board, which have been provided in way of the rules, that on which notices can be emailed or can be sent as hard copy. So last but not the least, section 282 capital A, which provides when and how a notice issued by the income tax authority would be treated as a authentic notice. So for the purpose that any notice is treated as a authentic notice, it requires that the name and office of the designated income tax authority is printed, stamped, or otherwise written on the notice. Unless it is there, the authentication of the notice can be called in question. And regarding the different modes in hard copy and in soft copy, how it should be there, Rule 127 capital A has been formulated, and it has been provided in case of email. If the notice is in the email body, then the name and office of the designated income tax authority should be there in the email body. And if the notice is being sent as an attachment, it should be there in the attachment. And the email should come from the designated email address of the authority. Similarly, for the electronic record also, the name and office, if it is in the electronic record itself, the context of the notice, then the name and office should be in the text of the electronic record. And if it is in the attachment, it should be there in the attachment. And this electronic record should be displayed on the designated website. So, sir, these are the important provisions with respect to the how the service of notice should be made and when can the notice be deemed to be as authentic notice coming from the designated income tax authority. With this, I thank you all for the patient hearing, and I hand over to Gupta sir for taking it forward. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Somil, for laying down the nice groundwork by detailing about what kind of notices are there which we all encounter in our day-to-day life as practicing chartered accountant or a practicing lawyer. Now, I would pick up the thread from this stage and then would deal with certain nuances arising out of these notices and then the responses which have to be made. Because if the responses are not made appropriately to varying kinds of notices at this stage, then it is bound to create a grave prejudice for the ultimate cause of our client. And whatever I will discuss with you today is based upon my practical experience of almost 35 years in varying capacities. So one notice, which is notice under section 179. There are several notices, as all of you know, which are not appealable. And so if they are not appealable, then the course of action which is open for an SSE is to approach the High Court. Therefore, whatever submissions you will make at this stage in response to such kind of notices now would ultimately become the bedrock on the basis of which the entire edifice of your writ petitions, which you would file or for that matter your client would file, now would rest. So in that series, the first notice which comes to my mind, in respect of which I would implore that the responsible response should be prepared, is the notice under section 179 of the Income Tax Act. And there is a special purpose because of which I have taken. Now, first of all, section 179 says that if there is a tax due from a private company which cannot be recovered from it, that every person who was the director of such private company at any time during the previous year to which this tax demand relates, then would be jointly and severally liable in respect of the tax, and the tax has come to be defined, tax, interest and penalty. Initially there was penalty not included into it, but then Ashwini Taneja ji, my partner, happened to argue one case from the Delhi High Court in Sanjay Ghai, whereby this ratio was laid down, the penalty now would not be forming part of the amount of tax because of the specific meaning given to the word tax, and thereafter this amendment came in 2013. So now this is a very serious notice. The liability of a company, private company, now is fastened at the door of any person who at any point of time during that previous year to which this demand relates has been the director. And the burden by the discharge of which he can wriggle out himself is when he proves what he has to prove, that this demand is not as a result of his gross neglect, misfeasance, or breach of trust. So these words which have been deployed and used by the legislature in section 179, and that too for this person to come out by demonstrating that this is not as a result of his gross neglect, misfeasance, or breach of duty. So whatever inputs you would submit while replying to this notice under section 179, whatever evidences would you file at this stage in response to that notice in support of your claim that this demand for which you are trying to fasten on my head is not as a result of any willful neglect, gross misfeasance, or breach of trust, then that alone will become the part of the writ petition. Because when on facts you will make submissions before the assessing officer that this is not a result of all these factors, then obviously the assessing officer would try to meet them. And then your response and the counter response of the assessing officer, that will be exposed to judicial scrutiny before the High Court. Therefore, this has to be taken care of. Similarly, in section 142 subsection 2 capital A, which empowers the assessing officer in certain situations on the fulfillment of certain conditions to make a reference for the special audit. Now against this there is no appeal prescribed. Therefore, if by the order passed by the assessing officer, and obviously he would pass the order after giving you the opportunity, then order though would be passed, but then that will not be appealable. So the only course which is open for you against this kind of an order is to approach the High Court. Therefore, it becomes very essential for you to respond it very responsibly, so that you may not be found wanting with the necessary material, at least on the factual grounds. On the legal ground, no problem. On the factual grounds, to support your case before the High Court, because the assessing officer can order for the special audit, of course after giving opportunity hearing, on account of what? When he finds that in view of the nature and complexity of account. So when he would bring it to your notice that because of this nature, because of this complexity of account, then he wants to make a reference. Meet them effectively on facts. Then because of the volume of account, he would say regarding the volume of account, he wants to make a reference. Then about the doubts of the correctness of the account, then he will bring some instances in his notice that there are doubts regarding the correctness of accounts because of these reasons on facts. Then multiplicity of transactions in the accounts, that can also be one of the reasons, but then he will have to say, and then he will have to give justifications, material in support of his discharge. And then specialized nature of the business of the assessee, and of course in the interest of revenue. So anything which an assessing officer would do is always in the interest of revenue. But then these elements, earlier it used to be only nature and complexity of account and the interest of revenue. But then few years back, all these ingredients are also incorporated in section 142 capital A. Therefore, while making response, because this is the first and last opportunity for you to make responses, that is very important, because in case of an order which is appealable, then you can move additional evidences for the CIT appeal, after of course seeking his permissions and making out your case within the limitations of rule 46A. But here, if you miss the bus, then maybe you may miss the bus, well, for all times to come. Therefore, your responsible response in such a situation is very essential. Similarly, now as there is section 263, that the principal commissioner has got power to revise an assessment order in case he finds it prejudicial to the interest of revenue and that order is erroneous. But then there is a simultaneous provision under section 264 whereby this kind of a power or this kind of an entitlement has been given to the SSE to apply to the principal commissioner to seek revision in support for his some kind of relief, benefit, rebate. So under section 264, in case the principal commissioner, after making the inquiry, as Somil has said that he will have to make inquiry, and then you will have to give replies in response to the questions posed by him when he makes the inquiry. So whenever he would pass order, if he accepts your revision petition under section 264, I mean then that is final, because why would you take it further in litigations, because when whatever you wanted that has been granted to you. And obviously there is nothing prescribed under the law which empowers the revenue department to appeal or to take it further before the higher appellate or the writ court. So this will attain finality. But then if an order adverse is passed, what kind of an order adverse is passed? Obviously the claim made by you in revision petition will not be accepted, because section 264 proceedings are not the adversarial proceedings. Principal commissioner cannot pass an order which is further prejudicial to your interest. That is what it has been given in section 264. So he can at best reject your claim, and accordingly he would pass an order rejecting your claim, and to that extent I am terming this kind of an order as an adverse order. Now against this adverse order there is no appeal. Obviously the only recourse which is available is the writ, and therefore in the writ court, whatever petition you have made, whatever replies with evidences you have submitted in response to the inquiry made by the principal commissioner, that alone would form the bedrock, that alone would form the basis of your attack in the writ petitions against that order. Therefore you have to be very responsible while drafting your revision petition, submitting all necessary evidences which are in support of your revision petitions along with the revision petition, and then when principal commissioner happens to make inquiry, and then your replies should be at least on facts, must be quite supportive, so that at later stage, in case an adverse order is passed, then you can support your writ petitions along with these pleadings only. Because if you want to introduce a new pleading on facts before the High Court, the department would say that where from it has come. It was never the case. It is a new fact, and on the new fact in the writ petitions, the High Court says that on the disputed questions of facts, whether we should enter for granting you relief in such exceptional and extraordinary remedy of writ. Now that also becomes quite a bone of contention. So disputed questions of facts are not to be adjudicated in writ. For that there is an appellate mechanism, there may be a separate mechanism. Then there is one more order which comes to my mind. When Somil was speaking, all these things came to my mind. Then order under section 127, which is passed by the commissioner, when the territorial jurisdiction is sought to be transferred from one city to another city. Though he has got power under section 127 to transfer the case from one assessing officer to another assessing officer also. But this order under section 127, which is passed while transferring the case from one assessing officer located and situated in one city to another assessing officer situated and located in another, is then he is required to give you opportunity of hearing. And after soliciting, eliciting and receiving your objections, then he is required to pass an order. He may accept, then he may choose not to transfer your case, but then those instances are not very many, because when the proceeding under section 127 is taken by the commissioner, then ultimately he will, in all probability, and of course that would depend upon the nature of your explanations also, but in all probability then he would end up in transferring your jurisdiction from the assessing officer of one town or city to another assessing officer of a different town or city. Now, against this order, there is no appeal prescribed, though many times our professional friends tend to take this issue of transfer of territorial jurisdiction from one city to another before the CIT appeal also, but then it is not appealable. Therefore, the only course which is open to you is to file a writ petition before the High Court of the appropriate judicature, where the principal commissioner is situated, because that will be the seat of the High Court, before whom then you would obviously tend to file. Yes, you want to ask some question?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes.
So basically, you said transferring the case from one city to another city, but within this jurisdiction of the commissioner, both the cities are coming, or the two cities are coming under different two commissioners?
No, even if that city is coming within the jurisdiction of one commissioner, then also he is required to issue you the notice, because transfer of a case from one city to another it is presumed that is going to cause some problem and hardship, and therefore he is required under the law to give you opportunity to seek your objections and then decide. Anyway, so 127 order. Now your entire gamut of your challenge before the High Court would be based on your reply which you submit as to how it would impact you adversely in case your jurisdiction is transferred from one city to another. Now, whatever weighty evidences on facts and contentions on facts you bring, that alone will become, because then commissioner in his order would try to trash what we have said and what we have filed, and then on those facts, then it would become the bone of contentions before the High Court in the writ. Therefore, one has to be very responsible. I have seen, and as I said, Goel Saab, in the beginning, that I am sharing whatever is my experience of 35 years. And when I say that I am sharing, then that means that I have seen such kind of instances where adequate pleading on facts have not been made, and the notice under section 127 has been taken very casually while replying. And at later stage, once he passes an order, then it will be very difficult for us to make up deficiencies on fact. Now, Somil spoke about a notice under section 12AB. 12AB is a section of very recent origin. I and Somil happened to write one article which has been published very recently in Taxman on the latest registration regime on the charitable trust and institutions. And we had occasions to closely examine 12AB, and all those things which are there have already been mentioned in an article. I need not to go on that. But in respect of 12AB, in certain situations, it has been so prescribed under subsection 1 that the commissioner or the competent authority, commissioner or principal commissioner, now will embark upon inquiry. Only then, if he is satisfied based upon these things which I am going to submit, then he would issue you the registration certificate, or otherwise he would cancel it. It has already been granted, he would cancel it. If you are applying for the first time, then he would reject it also. So the inquiry, as Somil has pointed out, will have to be made by him that the activities carried on by you are genuine. The objects are charitable, and you have complied with the requirements of any other special law which is applicable on you. The fulfillment of that requirement is material for the purpose of you achieving your charitable object. So his inquiry will be in respect of these facets. He is entitled to make inquiry. He is entitled to call for the information, and then based upon his inquiry, then he can issue the show cause notice. So in respect of these facets, your response has to be very responsible on facts, because the appeal would lie before the tribunal. That will be as good as the first appeal, but then the tribunal's power to admit additional evidence of facts is circumscribed by Rule 29 of the Appellate Tribunal Rules. Therefore, we should not tend to take this as a matter as if it has been granted, that any material on facts or submissions on facts which we have not placed before the commissioner now would be placed by us before the tribunal on the grounds that it goes to the root of the matter and therefore you should take it, but that is very risky. Or even if the tribunal then tends to take it as additional evidence at that stage, then the tribunal's choice is very limited. Then in all probability there will not be any option with the tribunal but to remit this matter back to the file of the principal commissioner to take into account the effect of this additional evidence. Then there is a provision under section 12AB itself, subsection 4 and 5. Subsection 4 says, and this is very serious, and why is this serious? I am going to narrate. And therefore, since it is so serious, therefore it is all the more necessary for all of us to be very responsible while replying. 12AB4 says that where after the grant of registration under subsection 1 A and B of section 12AB, then if it is found that the activities of the trust being carried out are not in accordance with the objects of the trust, and SSE, let me read because this is a new section, are not genuine and our activities of such trust are not genuine or are not being carried out in accordance with the objects of the trust, then after giving you the show cause notice, seeking your objections, then he can pass an appropriate order. He may be convinced also, but you take it based upon my experience, I can say, and so must be yours also. Once the process is initiated at the level of such high-ranking officials of the principal commissioner's stature, then that action is not taken in vacuum. That action is taken with the backup material which is available with him. Therefore, such kind of notice has to be replied very responsibly on facts. So when he says your activities are not genuine, he must be giving some reasons. He must be supporting those reasons with evidence. Then there must be very effective counter reply supported with evidence. If he says your activities are not carried out in accordance with the objects of the trust, then obviously he would support his allegations with some evidence. You also counter reply in such a manner that meets his objections on facts at least and with supported with evidence. Then 12AB subsection 5. This is also very important. Though it was there under section 12AA also, but then there is some amendment which has been made very cleverly by the legislature. Now, this also says that if trust has been granted registration and then the activities of the trusts are being carried out in such a manner that you incur the disability of section 13 subsection 1. Section 13 subsection 1, when part of the income or property has been applied directly or indirectly for the benefit of the related parties, when the funds of the trusts are not kept in the forms and manner prescribed under section 11(5), when your property is held for private religious purposes, or when the charitable institution's property has been earmarked or institution has been created for the benefit of any particular religious community or caste. So, if your activities are carried out in such a manner that you incur any one or more combinations out of these 4 situations which are prescribed under section 13 subsection 1, then you are giving a handle to the principal commissioners to withdraw your registration. Therefore, when such kind of show cause comes, then obviously your response has to be in a very measured way responsible on facts at least. So if he has supported his allegations with evidence, then your reply should also be supported with comprehensive evidence. And the second situation which has been envisaged is that if that trust to whom the registration has been granted now is found to have not complied with any requirement of a special law. Suppose if you are an educational institution, you are running, say, for some college in which engineering classes. Now, under certain acts which govern the educational institutions, you are prohibited from taking capitation fee. So you are violating the requirement of that law. You are not complying with the requirement of that law which prohibits you from accepting the capitation. So if you are found not to have complied with the requirement of an special law, and that order, adverse order, has been passed for the violation of that provision of that special law, you have not appealed, or even if you appeal, you lost, and that adverse order has attained finality, then Principal Commissioner under the Income Tax Act, based upon this kind of an adverse order, now is entitled to cancel your registration under Section 12AB, but of course, after giving you opportunity to hearing. And when this kind of a show cause is given under Section 12AB subsection 5, then obviously your response has to be very responsible, meeting out, because after all, this rejection order, and once the registration is cancelled, then there is Section 115 TD. If you remember, पहले तो इस बात का झगड़ा होता था कि साहब ये जो रजिस्ट्रेशन कैंसिल होगा, ये प्रोस्पेक्टिव होगा, रिट्रोस्पेक्टिव होगा, आज से होगा. Now, in order to give quietus to all these controversy, the legislature has said that let us make Section 115 TD. Let us make Section 115 TD. Now, which provide that if your registration has been cancelled, there are two more situations. When you have been dissolved and you have not distributed your assets to other charitable trusts of the like objects, or when you have merged yourself with such an entity which is not eligible to be registered under Section 12AA or 12AB. So, but then this cancellation of registration is also one of the situations which has been envisaged under Section 115 TD. And in case that cancellation happens, then Section 115 TD would automatically flow, and fair market value of all the assets and liabilities, you will have to pay tax at the rate of 30%, and that tax is to be paid on the accredited income. Anyway, so now you see the seriousness of the consequence of the cancellation of registration. Then certain notices require response positively from your end, and in case you do not file your response, much less responsibly, then obviously you are ousted from raising these objections before the higher forum. The first notice is that if you receive a notice from an assessing officer who does not have the territorial jurisdiction, who does not have the jurisdiction to assess you, then in that situation, you are required to raise your objection within 30 days. In case you have filed your return, you receive notice under Section 143(2) or 142(1), then within 30 days from the receipt of such notice from such non-territorial jurisdictional officer, then you must raise objections as to the absence of the jurisdiction of that assessing officer.
I hope internet connection, broadband connection of Dr. Rakesh Gupta ji is weak at this moment, and not